Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Um, who wants to go first?
Uh, I'll go first. Because my voice is gonna die. So I'll just get it out of the way. So I guess what I'll just do is kind of go through each section of the memo and kind of run through it really quick and try to stick to just the main points. So for Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations, the sort of one sentence gist that I think you need to get is that peace between nations rests upon accepting the right view of human nature, which he kind of gets at, like, you need to be restrained and understand man as a fallen human being that seeks power. Um, the international system is predicated upon states pursuing their own interests and balancing against their rivals. That makes understanding the national interests of other nations critical for avoiding war, which leads Morgenthau to conclude that negotiation and diplomacy are critical for being able to achieve accommodation of other nations' interests. So for the paradigm section, Morgenthau is essentially the father of classical realism. He admits that politics can be limited by prescriptive norms held in common, but he admits that they aren't foolproof because human nature prevents perpetual peace because humans desire power and therefore nations desire power. He's therefore, anti-constructivism, anti-democratic universalism. He also kind of contrasts with the more Machiavellian sort of type of realism. So it's not politics all the way down. He does admit that norms and culture have somewhat of a role, but again, it's not foolproof. His thesis is that state behavior emerges out of the national interest. Peace is maintained through acknowledging and accommodating the interests of other nations. Again, that's via diplomacy, but it's not foolproof because of human nature, which is why war is a continual event. It always persists. States jockey for a favorable status quo via power politics, which consists of persuasion, coercion, bargaining, and threatening. So the big question, and this is kind of where I'm least confident, and maybe you guys have more insights into this, but his main big question, essentially, when he's publishing in 1948, right at the start of the Cold War, is that he's trying to show a middle path between neo-isolationism, so just going back to pre-World War II for the U.S., and then the alternative would be the sort of democratic crusade camp, which is wanting to spread democracy globally, which he thinks will provoke the communist bloc into going to war with the West. And he thinks in his middle path will preserve peace because it acknowledges that state actions are rooted in interests. So for my in-depth summary, I focused on the first chapter, which lists the 6 principles of realism, and then the last 2 chapters, which are about renewing diplomacy. So I'll run through those really quick, but those are in the memo. So for the first chapter, excuse me, political realism believes that politics is governed by objective laws that are rooted in human nature. They are guided. Political realism is guided through the landscape of international politics by the concept of interest defined in terms of power, and that seems to be a very important phrase throughout the book. And that kind of insulates decision making from being co-opted by ideology, which he thinks is flawed. Good foreign policy is rational, and by that he means that it minimizes risks and maximizes benefits, and that meets the definition of prudence and political success. And again, prudence is another important theme throughout the work. Next is political realism assumes that interest defined as power doesn't have a fixed meaning but can change with time and circumstance. So he's almost kind of Burkean in how he develops his theories out of practice, which I think is also an important thing to remember. Next is political realism believes that political action is morally significant, and political success and moral command, so moral considerations, can be in tension at times, and that moral judgments have to consider circumstances of time and place, and that their political morality doesn't exist without prudence, which is the political consequences of action. Realism contends that prudence, again, is the supreme virtue of politics. Political realism refuses to identify national aspirations with objective moral law. So, no nation has a perfect knowledge of good and evil, and that means that there's no. Morgenthau's extremely cautious of nations that either construe themselves as the good guy and the other as the bad guy. He's very much wary of that, because that gets kind of back to the Democratic Crusade. It's more warlike to think in such absolute terms. And then the last of the 6 rules, again, like these are all listed if I've not been clear on the memo. The political realist maintains the autonomy of the political sphere, which means that he thinks that the political realist is talking about interest defined as power, but there are other ways to define interests. So economics would identify interest as profit. Lawyers would talk about interest in terms of legality. Moralists would talk about interest defined as taking the most moral course of action. Realism contends, or he admits to these other types of interest because he thinks that man is multifaceted, and a man who only thinks in political terms or thinks in political terms all the time is like this hyper Machiavellian beast. And then, so moving on to the penultimate chapter. This is the 4 tasks of diplomacy, which he defines again as peace through accommodation. Diplomacy must determine the state's objectives in light of what power is, and the diplomacy must determine the state's objectives in light of what power actually is and potentially available to pursue the objectives. It must assess the objectives of other nations and their actual and potential power to pursue their objectives. And then diplomacy determines how compatible the interests of your own nation and the other nation are. And if they're incompatible, they have to decide how vital each interest is and decide whether it's worthwhile to pursue one's own interest, even though that might prompt a response from the other nation. So ways of getting out of that situation where you're at an impasse would be bargaining and then potentially negotiating to redefine your state or the other state's vital interests in order to avert war. And again, this last point goes in with prudence as well, that diplomacy must employ suitable means for pursuing its objectives, which again are persuasion, compromise, and the threat of force. And then he talks a bit about the decline of diplomacy, so I'll try to go through these really quick. So essentially what has led to the decline of diplomacy since World War I is modern communications, the kind of denigration of secret diplomacy. So this is like, smoke-filled rooms that's gotten a bad rap. The creation of the League of Nations and the UN, and the Cold War dynamic of inflexible bipolar powers. So all those have hurt traditional diplomacy and impeded its function. So the last chapter is the future of diplomacy, where he talks about how to revive it. So he says that the most threatening of the 4 from the previous chapter that hurt traditional diplomacy are going to be the second and third. So that's the deprecation of the smoke-filled rooms and the great power politics and the deals that they make between each other, and parliamentary diplomacy, which is what he calls the UN. Since states jockey for power, it isn't helpful to take away their means of arbitrating their differences in the smoke-filled rooms, essentially. Parliamentary diplomacy brings diplomacy out into the public, and the world is the audience, which leads to this sort of crusader rhetoric of like, you should side with me because my side is good and they're evil. Is essentially what he says happens, which doesn't actually solve anything. Um, and then the 9 rules of diplomacy, just for the sake of time, I won't go through them in great detail, but they're listed there. But they essentially follow up on those points. And then like just a few concluding remarks is that he thinks that sweeping solutions which are universal in scope presuppose an integrated international society, which he says is doomed to failure because an international society like that doesn't exist. Diplomacy is the best means for preserving peace, but it isn't foolproof, and world states are impossible because a world community must precede states, and since there isn't a world community, you can't have a world state. Yeah, I'll leave it there. But the rest of that is on the memo, so I gave myself an overall confidence level of 8. Yeah.
Great.
That was great. That was very helpful.
Yeah. I think I'm just going to go ahead and move on. I think it's better if we all go through our 4, and then if we have time, we can chat about it afterward.
Yeah.
So I'll go through Waltz's international politics. Going to share my... let's see, where is it? There we go. Going to share my screen. Can you all see that okay?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So instead of going through the chapter by chapter, which I have summaries, I'm just going to kind of do a broad overview. So Waltz was kind of the guy who came up with, he sort of formulated neorealism to start off, but this one's really kind of his exploration of what became defensive realism. So the main way he kind of structures his book is by beginning with what he calls like reductive theories, and the clearest reductive theory is Marxism. So reductive theory is like explaining the international system through something like economics, as Marxists do. So he goes through that. He says that doesn't work. Then he goes to system-level theories. System-level theories are about how systems interact, and he says these are generally better theories, but often people will kind of conflate the unit level with the system level, so they'll kind of stick them together, and that's something that constructivists do, where they say that the international system can be described by looking at how culture influences it, right? And he also says this is something that those who are traditionalists like Morgenthau and Kissinger kind of mess up too, which is that they will look at something like individuals and say that these individuals have a impact on the international system, and he says that's kind of like not logically sound. So he says actually what we need to look at is really be careful with our definitions and describe what is a system, and then with that baseline we can then start describing the international system. So this begins kind of in chapter 5, and I've bolded, as you can see, how those structures are defined as like how you can define a system. And so he says first it's kind of questions the arrangement of the parts of the system. So in international relations, an anarchic system, the structure is an anarchic system where mostly rational states seek survival. Although he says they might seek other goals like world domination, but the baseline is that they all seek survival and they're all mostly rational. He says also then you need to go and look at the character of the system, and that describes which units do the functioning. So for the international system, this is the state. So this is where he says a lot of those who are maybe traditionalists like Morgenthau and Kissinger mess up, or the constructivists mess up, which is that they will say that the individual does the functioning on the state system, which he says doesn't even make sense logically. So this, he's looking at the states specifically. And then number 3 is the distribution of capabilities. So it's like who has the power in the system, and how is that power kind of distributed. So he says the easiest way to look at this is just the number of great powers. And he says this is not like, it might look like it's a going into the more national level or individual levels, but he says it's not, because it doesn't matter where like the great powers are, and it doesn't matter who the great powers are. It's just like the number of great powers, and that's what kind of describes what the international system is. So then he goes through and kind of talks a little bit more in depth about what those characteristics are on the international system. So this is chapter 6. If you wanted to read it, what I would do is read chapter 5 and 6. Those are the most important chapters, I think, for really understanding what he's getting at. But he goes through, and I've listed on the chapter 6 summary kind of what he is, how he says those characteristics of anarchy create the system, the international system, and what kind of outcomes you can expect to see by having anarchy as kind of the baseline. So that states have the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. He clarifies, like, legitimate means that, like, sure, a mafia might have a monopoly on the use of violence within, like, their little block that they control in a city, but that's not legitimate violence. Legitimate violence stays at the states. Number 2, states live in a self-help world where they must spend on defense. 3, states cannot escape the system. 4, the system itself is cheap to maintain. And 5, anarchy does not mean that there is not some organization. So what he means by that is that there may be like trade that happens, but or like international institutions, but none of those actually will like mean that anarchy does not exist. So he says, if you look at all of those and you actually come up with a good system, the only good theory of international politics is balance of power theory, which is what defensive realism, which becomes defensive realism. So chapters 7 and 8, he kind of looks at balance of power theory through economic and military means in order to gain power. So this is kind of examining how states will gain power while still kind of being within this international system. And then chapter 9 kind of gets into, as I say, the real meat and potatoes of the theory, which is that unipolar and bipolar systems are the most stable, since it's the easiest to maintain. But multipolar systems are unstable, since great powers will balance and bandwagon against each other at a more dynamic rate that makes it harder for the system itself to be managed. So that's kind of how Waltz sees the world. I've got the broad questions. He brings this up in chapter 1. He says those explicitly, those are quotations. And so that's kind of what guides his book. So the first bit answers what are the existing theories. The first and second chapter kind of does that. The third and fourth says how are those, how are there defects in there, and then he finally says how can they be remedied, and then what are the practical applications. So that's Waltz shortly.
I can jump in on Kant. Both of those were great, and it looked like you said you had a confidence level of 8. Is that right, Clay?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a defensive realist, so.
Yeah.
It's my guy.
I would say I have a confidence level of maybe about a 4. Given that I was a little bit behind and my memo is unfinished. Granted, I did study a lot of Kant early on, so I have some. In any case, I'll just go into it. I'll say my memo is unfinished, but it will be finished. I think because certain thinkers, if they are actual philosophers, I think there is a level of depth and complexity that makes it difficult to say what they think. So my memo will include a longer section on notes, basically the way I do my reading, where I will have specific quotes and then try to say in a bullet point, what is he actually saying here? But in any case, so this is 1795, To Perpetual Peace, a Philosophic Sketch. I'll just note that David Clinton would note with some humor that the place where he writes this, Prussian Königsberg, is now Kaliningrad, Russia, which is a site of significant strategic importance for the Russians, with several military installations. I think there are 2 pieces that one might need to understand to really understand this. It just might. So he has an earlier piece which he seems to kind of disregard here or refute in some way. I'm going to talk with Paul, who has I think, better understanding of German political philosophy than I do, and has done a lot of Kant, and get a handle on that. And then also, he has several essays on the relationship between theory and practice, which is something that he kind of starts off with here. But it's certainly not a total account. So, and that's a question, I think, for any of these thinkers. To what extent do these rules transfer into actual political practice? Even if we can derive, say, if Morgenthau can derive principles and rules that people ought to follow, how do we put those into practice? And that's something Kant is deeply concerned with. So Kant is concerned with the possibility of perpetual peace. I will say it is shot through with a certain realism. We might think of him as an idealist in some way, but it's actually the case. I think one of the core sort of arguments he makes in the work, let me just find this here, is that, he explicitly agrees, he sounds like Hobbes at a certain point, and he explicitly agrees with realists that there is a certain depravity of human nature that causes men to rely on force. And then he notes that despite the efforts of men like Grotius, Pufendorf, and Vattel to impose certain rules and legal restraints, external legal restraints, international law, we failed to live up to that. But he also recognizes that in their very desire to assert what is right and wrong, and in nations' desire to assert what is right and wrong and to make treaties, there's a certain moral inclination in men to overcome our depravity and seek peace. He notes a problem, which is to say he takes peace as in the same way Hobbes would, which would be a situation in which there's no possibility of hostility. So the problem is we want to avoid war because it threatens the right of sovereign nations. To abolish war, we would have to form a cosmopolitan world state, which is what he seems to predict in that earlier essay some 10 years later. To do so, to form a cosmopolitan world state, would necessarily abolish nations. So as such, the very desire that we wish to fulfill, which is to protect our rights, precludes the solution to fully protect that desire. That, I think, those two things are really the core of this. And the solution he will lay out is he'll give you 6 preliminary articles, and then he'll give you 3 definitive articles, and then some supplementary ones. I need to get a better handle on the supplementary, but I'll just lay out briefly the preliminary and the definitive. The preliminary, the 6 are, and this will all be in the memo, no treaty of peace that tacitly reserves issues for a future war shall be held valid. So treaties cannot set aside problems that, they can't leave things unresolved. The second would be no independent nation, be it large or small, may be acquired by another nation by inheritance, exchange, purpose, or gift. I'm fairly certain this is explicitly stated in the UN Charter, but it's sort of shot through the concern for sovereignty. Standing armies shall be gradually abolished. No national debt shall be contracted in connection with the foreign affairs of a nation. So some of these are qualified, this one in particular. He's not saying we can't lend each other money for building roads, helping people with food aid, things like that. There's certain qualifications he gives, but as an instrument in the struggle among powers, particularly he's extremely concerned with international credit systems, which he thinks not only increase certain nations' means for war, but also leave other nations in a slavish position. And then the last 2 are no nation shall forcibly interfere with the constitution and government of another, so no violations of sovereignty. And then the 6th is no nation shall permit such acts of wars that make mutual trust impossible during times of peace. So that would be things like assassins, poisoners, he says, breach of surrender, and instigation of treason in the opposing nation, which I take to mean, having something like getting men to sell state secrets and commit treason, etc. He qualifies these, and I need to understand the qualification better. But some of these, he says, are circumstantial, and the other ones we need are sort of. He uses prohibitive laws and then circumstantial laws. He has 2 Latin terms for them that I need to investigate. But in any case, numbers 1, 5, and 6, which are 5 not violating sovereignty, no treaties of peace that, allow things to stand that would cause further issues. And then the sixth one, which is don't use assassins, poisoners, etc. Those are the ones he says we need to implement right now. And then when he gets to the definitive things for war, for the avoiding war, it is to the extent we can, and this is, I need to better figure out the tension here between violation of sovereignty and this point, but he says every nation must move towards or have a republican constitution, and the second one is that they have to form a federation of free states. So, and then the third point is that cosmopolitan right is limited only to freedom of movement. It's a very limited freedom of movement. Basically, if someone enters your country, you don't immediately harm them. But you don't give them permanent residency. They can apply for that, but you have to let people come in and at least figure out what they're doing there, and then you can kick them out if you want. But those first two, I would say, he ends up pre-staging through all of these a lot of what ends up being sort of fundamental principles of the UN. But more importantly, I think you could kind of distill what Kant is talking about here as NATO, and saying, and it's actually in some ways a fairly realist approach, in terms of saying if you want something close to perpetual peace, then you need a federation of free states who are willing to use force to police others. That's kind of the main upshot. I think there's a lot of complication here that I need to suss out, which is why I rank it a 4. And the big question, I think, is, are we merely satisfied with something close to perpetual peace in a body like NATO, or does he actually think that over time we can expand the federation of free states such that we actually get something called perpetual peace? But that's what I have right now.
Thanks, Shane.
All right. I did Fukuyama's End of History. So, it's just the article, it's not a book, so it probably won't take me very long to go over it. But essentially the main argument is that with the end of the Cold War, the Western idea of liberal democracy presented itself as the final form of human government, and all alternatives, communism and fascism, have been exhausted. And so the end of the ideological evolution in government means the end of history. And then application to IR, he kind of does this at the end. And if you want to read something from it that's particular, there's a lot of stuff on like Hegel and Kojève in the beginning. But if you want to read something for the IR comps, the last bit talks about IR. So I'll kind of get into that in a minute. He seems to imply that the end of history means an end to war. And so the paradigms that he's operating in, he's really arguing against realism. This idea that war is kind of like inherent in the system, that we can't escape it. You probably also want to compare it to Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. If you haven't TA'd for Dr. Jordan, he sets this up as like a huge contrast. That's what like some of his classes is like, clash or end of history. So it'd be good to compare the two. And then also Fukuyama's operating in the German tradition with a lot of influence from especially Hegel's idea of history. So the broad question is, how do we explain the outbreak of peace in the post-Cold War era? And so kind of a deeper philosophic question is, like, what is history? Like I said, there's a lot of German stuff at the beginning. The essentials of it is that, you take Hegel's idea of history, it culminates in like an absolute moment. This is a direct quote: an absolute moment, a moment in which a final rational form of society and state became victorious. So how do we tell if liberalism is the final form of government? We have to see if there are any unresolved contradictions lying within it. And the main way that he does this is by examining alternatives. So the major challenges that we saw to liberalism were fascism and communism. Fascism was defeated on a material basis in World War II. And this material defeat meant the defeat of the idea as well. And this is because the basis of fascism, its whole argument, was like a love of physical strength, military courage, war for its own sake. And so the fact that it lost World War II meant that it as an idea was defeated. Um, so then there's the challenge presented by communism, which Fukuyama says is more serious. But he says that the contradiction between capital and labor is solved for by America's egalitarianism, which causes the class issue to recede. And so neither China nor the USSR can serve as beacons for the communist ideal. So China has been influenced by the economic prosperity of like democratic Asian countries, and there's no one left in the USSR government who really believes in Marxism. So though neither of them are liberal democracies themselves, and he seems to think like, oh, there's not much chance they will be liberal democracies. But the important thing is that they no longer have any credible claim to a higher way of human life than liberal democracy. So that's important, and like one question I would have about that would be if China and the USSR are not liberal democracies and he doesn't see them going there, later on, like that, how to explain this? It seems to me that like his argument for the end of war is that like, oh, once we're all liberal democracies, like we won't have this expansionist impulse, and so we won't have war anymore. So like the question I would have would be if China and the USSR are not liberal democracies and it doesn't look like they're going there, like can we really get perpetual peace? But anyway, so then he lays out two other alternatives, which might present themselves against liberal democracy, and that's religion and nationalism. So religion solves for, he admits there's an empty core to liberalism. And so religion can solve for that, but the only problem is that the only religion that's presented a real political alternative to liberalism is Islam. And this alternative is not appealing to non-Muslims. He doesn't really seem to address like the issue like, well, wouldn't the goal of Islam be to convert non-Muslims? Anyway, but so for nationalism, he says that nationalism expresses itself mainly as a desire for independence from some other people, and so it's not its own coherent political ideology. Like it's not like a positive program. It's more just like a negative, like not ruled by some other person. So because of that, nationalism can go together with liberalism, and it can the problem of nationalism can be solved with liberalism if only all nations are represented by themselves and not ruled by outsiders. So yeah, then applications to IR. So he seems to trace war to this kind of expansionist impulse, not impulse, behavior. So, and then he says, modern liberal democracies, they have defense spending and large armies because they're trying to counter like world communism and other things that have this expansionist behavior. So if that goes away, then their defense and army will go away as well. And he says this because international life, this is a direct quote, international life for the part of the world that has reached the end of history is far more preoccupied with economics than with politics or strategy. Yeah, it seems to imply like, oh, once we all become liberal democracies, there will be no war. Yeah, and then like one other question I would have about this too is that he says he explains like the competitive behavior of the 19th century European states, and the fact that he says, for one thing, most liberal European societies were illiberal insofar as they believed in the legitimacy of imperialism, that is, the right of one nation to rule over the other nations without regard for the wishes of the ruled. So this seems to be kind of circular. Like you just get to define like, oh, what's a liberal state? Oh, a liberal state is the state that does what I want it to do, and then illiberal states are the ones who expand. I don't know if that makes sense. It seems just kind of circular. But anyway, so yeah, I think that's all I have for Fukuyama.
Awesome. Well, I think this is helpful. So I guess I know. So you guys, Marley, do you have that in a polished memo? I do not. I'm gonna finish my memo, but it sounds like Clay and Steven, you guys would be ready to upload those.
Yeah, I've been working as a working copy on the Teams, just
okay,
straight
cool.
off of that. So and I'll do that throughout. So if y'all just want to check my progress or whatever,
Yeah.
check to make sure
I'm doing the exact same thing. I just make the document in our folder on Teams, and I just start and finish all the way on Teams. Yeah.
Could I ask a question or two about Waltz real quick?
Yeah.
Does he explicitly introduce the term black box, or is this a later
This
term?
is later. I'm pretty sure this is introduced by Mearsheimer.
Okay, all right. That's what I was wondering. But we could probably feasibly apply. We'd have to know that, but we could probably feasibly apply it to his argument.
Yeah, because he says and he draws a lot of parallels to kind of the American side of political science when he's talking about this, where he says he's like, people will criticize this theory by saying, oh, we're not looking at individuals, but individuals do matter. And he's kind of funny. He goes, well, the Americanists do that too with their studies of bureaucracies and political parties. It's like they don't say in political parties, oh, this political party only matters because of these individual people in it. So in much the same way, sure, individuals are playing a role, but and he does caveat it. He says in times of extreme crisis, maybe individuals will do something. So I think this is him kind of explaining World War II.
Makes room for Churchill.
Yeah. But he says in 99% of circumstances, the only thing that's really that individuals really do is abide by kind of the international system, because if they attempt to change it, they'll just get removed.
Okay. And do you use the term neo-realist and structural realist interchangeably? Or should I distinguish those?
I use them interchangeably. Okay, all right. Yeah. So he kind of invented neo-realism, which neo-realism and structuralism are essentially the same. Structural realism are essentially the same on this one. And then Mearsheimer takes this and kind of makes it offensive realism, which we can distinguish once we get to Mearsheimer too, I think. Because that's worth doing, is distinguishing those defensive versus offensive realism.
And I think I just wanted to add, I think, especially for our department, given its theoretical bend, noting that Waltz is like the start of IR as a social science is something,
Yeah, I think putting, if you want to go on the realist route in terms of it, I think you have to, in terms of answering questions, you have to contend with Morgenthau, Waltz, and Mearsheimer. So Morgenthau, kind of the foundation of realism, Waltz kind of bringing this more structural approach to it, and then Mearsheimer going in from that and saying this is why states want to gain power in a way that the other two don't really account for.
Is E.H. Carr on the list?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, he is.
He is.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I don't know. I mean, I haven't. It's been a while since I read Mearsheimer, and I don't know. We're just doing free discussion right now. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna have to hop off momentarily, so I don't mean to monopolize. And I also forgot to hit record. I don't know if I was supposed to do that or.
I recorded it to YouTube anyway.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
So I'll make chapters and then put in the chat or in the Excel document the start times of all of this, so you can just click on that and go.
And if you guys want to keep talking after I leave, feel free, and I'll gladly check out the recording. I just wanted to say on Morgenthau and Stephen, I really appreciated your overview, and I don't know, I think putting it in conversation with his with Scientific Man versus Power Politics, it seems to me that Morgenthau really is shot through with really shot through with like a classical disposition and classical concern. If I recall correctly, the person he cites most in Scientific Man is Aristotle. I think it's 9 citations, and so he has this interesting, like when we look at even people like Hobbes or maybe even Machiavelli, we might accuse of a sort of ironically idealism in their. This might go too far with these two, but in their sort of optimism for once you acknowledge the depravity of human nature and that everything is power, what can you accomplish in terms of structuring the international system or exercising power? So the gulf between like E.H. Carr and Morgenthau, in terms of Morgenthau being so preoccupied with limitations and diplomacy versus Carr starting from very similar baseline assumptions and moving to an emphasis on social planning and on sort of policing of great powers, which is ironically basically exactly FDR's approach to the international system. And it's only the State Department that brings into being the other external elements of the international system. But his hope was just to disarm everyone and have, various policemen. But I just think that's an interesting, and Morgenthau to me just seems like a very unique, have a very unique position among some of the other even classical realists in that regard.
Yeah, that's good. I definitely agree.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, this is really helpful. Thank you, guys. I don't know if you're going to stay on, but I do have to go, unfortunately. I don't know if this time is. I have a set recording for my podcast at noon. Mm-hmm. If it's normally an hour, this is totally fine. And this was even helpful if we just want to rip through it. But I just flagged that for you guys in terms of scheduling. Either way, it works out for me. But
I still think Thursday should be our main go-to. But I think we just had that dissertation thing that was being put on by Joe.
Is that okay? All right, I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Normally it will be on Thursdays, yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna have to leave.
Great.
Thanks,
Shane.
Take care.
I gotta head out too. I've got class at 12:30, but
Oh yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Marley.
yeah. See y'all.
See ya.
Yeah. I'm gonna hop off as well, so I'll see you later.
Sounds good. See you, Steven. Feel better.